What if a jury's job wasn't just to judge a person, but to judge the law itself? Today we're digging into a fascinating story out of Washington, D.C. that really puts a spotlight on one of the most powerful and, frankly, controversial tools that regular citizens have in the entire justice system, the grand jury.
Now, to really get why what's been happening in D.C. is so wild, you first have to understand how a grand jury is supposed to work. And according to one former prosecutor we're sourcing, for the government, it was usually, well, a walk in the park, a spa day even.
So why a spa day? How could that be? Well, it's because the whole system, by design, is kind of tilted in a way that gives prosecutors a huge advantage.
I mean, just think about how different this is from any trial you've seen on TV. The prosecutor basically runs the whole show. There are no defense attorneys in the room to argue back. And, get this, they don't even have to show evidence that might suggest the person is innocent. All they need is probable cause, which is the lowest possible legal bar. It's basically just enough to say, hey, a crime might have happened here. So failing to get what you want is, well, it's pretty rare.
How rare? We're talking about a 99% success rate. In fact, some of the former federal prosecutors said they went their entire careers, we're talking decades, without ever seeing a grand jury say no to one of their cases. It's that much of a sure thing.
But then, recently in Washington, D.C., that sure thing kind of stopped being so sure.
Not once, not twice, but 7 times in just a matter of weeks. In a system where no is almost never the answer, grand juries made up of local D.C. citizens refused to bring felony charges in 7 different cases from the U.S. Attorney's Office.
So, let's be perfectly clear. This is not normal at all. It's a major departure from how things are supposed to work, and it raises this huge question that we're going to try and unpack here. What is going on?
And to even begin to get our heads around it, you have to look at the actual cases these jurors were hearing. Because we're talking about everything from thrown sandwiches to scuffles with federal agents.
All right, so here's the most famous one. A guy named Sean Dunn throws a sandwich at a federal officer during a protest. The reaction from the prosecutor's office was, well, let's just say it was intense, with the U.S. attorney herself posting this pretty direct message on social media.
They wanted to charge him with a felony that could mean years in prison for throwing a sandwich. And despite all that public pressure, the grand jury, made up of regular citizens, just said, nope, not going to do it.
And look, this wasn't just a one-off thing about a sandwich. It was a clear pattern. Jurors also said no to felony charges for people who allegedly threatened the president and for a guy who got into it with a cop at a traffic stop. In one case, with a woman who scuffled with immigration agents, prosecutors tried to get an indictment 3 separate times, and they got shot down.
Okay, so this string of rejections leads us to the real mystery here. Why? Why was this happening all of a sudden? According to the experts, it really boils down to 2 main theories.
On the one hand, there's the simple explanation. Maybe the prosecutors just had weak cases. Maybe they just failed to clear that super low bar of probable cause. But then there's the second possibility, which is way more profound. What if this wasn't about the evidence? What if the jurors were making a statement, taking a principled stand?
And that second idea, well, it has a name: jury nullification. It's this incredible and pretty controversial concept that says jurors can judge the law itself, not just the facts. They can refuse to indict someone, even if they're technically guilty, if they believe the law, or the way it's being used in that specific case, is just plain wrong or unfair.
So, jurors pushing back on the government like this, is that a good thing? Is it a bug in the system, or is it a feature? Well, like with pretty much everything in law, it's a double-edged sword.
As the legal scholar Roger Fairfax puts it, this power carries both promise and peril.
On the one hand, it can be an amazing tool for justice, right? It's the people acting as a shield against a government that might be overreaching or getting too political. But on the other hand, there's a real risk. What if a biased jury just decides to ignore the law and let a clearly guilty and dangerous person walk free?
But the promise of it, the ideal version, is that it lets the community send a direct message. It's a way to guide law enforcement to tell prosecutors, hey, this is what we the people actually think is just, and this is where you should be focusing your resources.
And that brings us right back to our story. This is exactly what we're seeing in D.C., that these jurors are using this rare power to provide that exact kind of community guidance against what they see as federal overreach. So when you connect all the dots, the story here is pretty amazing.
You've got this obscure, often overlooked part of the legal system that suddenly becomes a battleground, where everyday citizens are using one of the very few real powers they have to send a direct message right back to the government.
Ultimately, the story of these DC grand juries isn't just about sandwiches or scuffles. It forces us to ask a really fundamental question that's at the very heart of our justice system. And it's one worth thinking about. When the citizens and the state disagree on what justice even looks like, who should have the final say?